The fastest way to lose respect is to assume you already deserve it. The Grand Regent Ballroom shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers worth more than most homes, their reflections dancing across polished marble floors as Manhattan's elite drifted between charity displays and champagne towers. Conversations about mergers, investments, and private islands floated through the air like background music. At the center of it all stood Richard Whitmore, the billionaire everyone seemed eager to impress. Wherever he moved, people made room. Wherever he looked, heads turned. It was the kind of power that came from decades of success, and Richard wore it as comfortably as his custom-tailored tuxedo. A few feet away, Maya Brooks moved quietly through the crowd, carrying a silver serving tray. Her black uniform blended into the evening so completely that most guests barely noticed her. That was fine with Maya. Being overlooked had become a skill. While executives competed for attention and socialites chased cameras, she focused on her work, calm and precise, never spilling a drop, never missing a detail. The gala had been running smoothly until one small accident changed the mood of the room. A glass of sparkling water tipped over near an important presentation table. The liquid spread across several printed documents before anyone could react. It wasn't catastrophic. The pages could be replaced in minutes. But Richard Whitmore wasn't interested in solutions. He was interested in finding someone to blame. His eyes landed on Maya. "Her," he said sharply. The conversation nearest him stopped. Several guests turned. Maya paused beside a column, tray still balanced effortlessly in one hand. Richard stepped forward. "Who hired her?" he demanded. A nervous event manager appeared almost instantly. "Sir, we're handling it." "Handling it?" Richard repeated. "She ruined part of the presentation. Fire her." The words echoed farther than he intended. Suddenly hundreds of eyes shifted toward Maya. Some guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Others simply watched, curious to see what would happen next. Public embarrassment had become a form of entertainment among people who rarely faced consequences themselves. The event manager looked trapped. "Mr. Whitmore, perhaps we should discuss this privately."
"No," Richard replied.
"I prefer clarity. People need accountability." Maya remained silent. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She didn't even set down the tray. That surprised Richard more than any apology would have. Most people rushed to explain themselves when confronted. Most people panicked. Maya simply looked at him, calmly, thoughtfully, as if she were observing something rather than experiencing it. The silence stretched. Richard smiled, confident the moment belonged entirely to him. Then Maya spoke. Her voice was soft enough that people leaned closer to hear. "Are you certain you want to continue?" The question sounded almost polite. Richard laughed. Several guests joined him. "Continue?" he asked. "You're in no position to give warnings." Maya studied him for another second. Then something unexpected happened. A faint smile touched her face. Not angry, not nervous, almost sympathetic. The expression unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. Slowly, she reached into the pocket of her uniform. The ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Conversations died. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Maya withdrew a small object attached to a dark leather holder. Under the chandelier light, a silver badge caught the room in a sudden flash. Richard's smile disappeared. For a long moment, nobody moved. The badge rested in Maya's hand, catching fragments of chandelier light as whispers spread across the ballroom like a sudden change in weather. Richard Whitmore stared at it without speaking. The confidence that had filled his voice seconds earlier seemed to evaporate. The event manager standing beside him took a small step back. Several guests exchanged uncertain looks. They had come expecting another glamorous evening. Instead, they were watching a scene none of them understood. Maya lowered the badge slightly. She did not wave it around. She did not make a speech. She simply slipped it back into its holder as if the gesture itself had already said enough. That calmness made the room even quieter. People who truly possessed authority rarely felt the need to announce it. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time all evening, he looked unsure. Maya gave him a polite nod before turning away. The crowd parted automatically as she walked toward a service entrance. No one stopped her. No one knew what to say. Behind the ballroom doors, the noise faded. The hallway beyond was cooler, dimmer, lined with framed photographs of charity galas from years past. Maya exhaled slowly. Her expression remained composed, but her eyes revealed the weight she had been carrying for months. She pushed through another door and entered a quiet operations room overlooking the ballroom through tinted glass. From there, the guests appeared like moving pieces on a chessboard. A man in a dark suit looked up from a monitor. "You got his attention," he said. Maya glanced back toward the ballroom. "That was never the objective." The man smiled faintly. "Maybe not, but it happened." Maya set her serving tray on a table and looked at the live camera feeds. Every entrance, every hallway, every private meeting room. Weeks of preparation had led to this night. Most people inside the gala believed she was just another temporary server hired for the event. That assumption had been useful. Invisible people noticed everything. Over the past 6 months, Maya had memorized faces, schedules, conversations, and patterns. She knew which executives arrived early, which donors stayed late, which guests avoided cameras. She knew who spoke loudly and who preferred whispers behind closed doors. More importantly, she knew that Richard Whitmore was not the reason she was there. He never had been. Across the ballroom, Richard stood near the center of the crowd, still surrounded by people, yet somehow looking more isolated than before. Questions followed him wherever he moved. What was the badge? Who was Maya? Why had the hotel executives reacted the way they did? Richard provided no answers because he had none. He found himself replaying the encounter again and again. The smile, the question, the certainty in her eyes. Then another thought bothered him even more. If Maya was not who she appeared to be, how long had she been there? His gaze drifted across the ballroom until it landed on an older man standing near one of the auction displays. The man raised a champagne glass and smiled warmly. Most guests saw a trusted friend, a business partner of nearly 20 years. Richard returned the gesture automatically. But for reasons he could not explain, an uneasy feeling settled into his chest. And behind the tinted glass above the ballroom, Maya was watching the exact same man. The man near the auction display was named Charles Bennett, and for nearly 2 decades he had occupied a place in Richard Whitmore's life that few people ever reached. They had built companies together, celebrated victories together, and survived economic storms that destroyed competitors twice their size. If someone had asked Richard to name the person he trusted most outside his family, Charles would have been the answer without hesitation. That was why the feeling growing inside him made no sense. Richard watched as Charles moved through the ballroom with effortless confidence, shaking hands, smiling for photographs, and exchanging warm greetings with donors. Nothing appeared unusual. Nothing appeared threatening. Yet Maya's attention had settled on him for a reason, and Richard could not ignore that fact. Across the room, a jazz quartet played softly while servers carried trays of desserts between tables. The gala had regained some of its rhythm, but an invisible tension lingered beneath every conversation. Guests continued stealing glances toward Richard. Some were curious. Others were cautious. A few seemed disappointed that the drama had ended so quickly. Richard checked his watch and attempted to focus on the charity auction beginning in 15 minutes. Instead, his thoughts kept returning to Maya Brooks. He had spent years reading people, investors, competitors, politicians. He understood arrogance, ambition, fear, and greed. But Maya had shown none of those things. What unsettled him most was not the badge. It was her reaction before revealing it. She had looked at him the way a teacher might look at a student making an avoidable mistake. The memory irritated him. Nearby, Charles approached carrying 2 glasses of sparkling water. "You look like a man who just lost an argument with himself," he said with a laugh. Richard accepted the glass.
Doi.
"You have been staring into space for 10 minutes. Charles lowered his voice. "Everyone is talking about the waitress." Richard glanced toward him. "And what are they saying?" Charles shrugged. Mostly guesses. Secret government agent. Undercover journalist. Wealthy heiress pretending to work here. People love mysteries. Richard managed a small smile. Do you believe any of that?
No.
Charles chuckled. I think she embarrassed a billionaire and now the room is inventing stories. The answer sounded reasonable. Too reasonable. Richard studied his friend's face. Charles remained relaxed, calm, completely unbothered by the evening's events. If Maya was watching him, she certainly was not seeing the version standing here now. Then Richard noticed something strange. For a fraction of a second, Charles's gaze drifted upward toward the tinted observation windows overlooking the ballroom. The movement was subtle, almost invisible, yet it happened. And for the first time all evening, Charles stopped smiling. The expression vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the familiar charm everyone expected. But Richard had already seen it. Meanwhile, behind the glass, Maya leaned closer to one of the monitors. A new notification had appeared on the screen. Time-stamped, verified, linked to a series of private transactions. The evidence she had spent 6 months waiting for was finally arriving. And every line pointed toward the same name. Charles Bennett. The notification remained on the screen for only a few seconds, but Maya had waited half a year to see it. She read every line carefully. Account transfers, meeting schedules, communication records. Individually, they looked harmless. Together, they formed a pattern impossible to ignore. The man standing 20 yards from Richard Whitmore was not merely a trusted advisor. He was positioned at the center of something much larger. Maya folded her arms and stared through the tinted glass. Below, the auction host stepped onto the stage and welcomed guests to the evenings. Headline fundraiser. Applause filled the ballroom. Crystal glasses shimmered beneath warm golden light. To everyone else, it looked like another successful gala. Maya knew better. Some of the most important decisions in business never happened in boardrooms. They happened at events exactly like this one, hidden behind smiles, handshakes, and charitable speeches. The man beside her in the operations room glanced toward the monitors. "We finally have confirmation," he said quietly. Maya nodded. "Confirmation is not enough. What else do you need?" She kept her eyes on the ballroom. The truth needs to reach the right person before someone else controls the narrative. Down below, Richard Whitmore listened to the auction presentation without hearing most of it. Charles Bennett stood beside him, appearing relaxed as ever. Yet Richard could not shake the feeling that something had shifted. For years, his instincts had helped him build an empire. He trusted those instincts more than spreadsheets, analysts, or headlines. And right now, those instincts were whispering that he had overlooked something important. The auction began. Exclusive vacation packages, rare artwork, luxury experiences. Wealthy guests raised paddles while the totals climbed higher and higher. Richard normally enjoyed these events. Tonight, he found himself distracted by details he would have ignored before. Charles checking his phone more often than usual. A brief conversation that ended the moment Richard approached. A glance toward a side exit. Tiny things. Almost meaningless. Almost. Then a server approached Richard's table carrying a sealed envelope. "This was left for you, sir." Richard frowned. "By whom?" The server shook his head. "I was only told to deliver it." Richard accepted the envelope. There was no name on the front.
No logo. No explanation.
Charles noticed immediately. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Probably nothing." Richard slid a finger beneath the seal. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. The message contained only one sentence.
No signature. No greeting.
No threat. Just 7 words. "Look closer at the people you trust most." Richard read it twice. Then a third time. A strange chill settled over him despite the warmth of the ballroom. He looked around instinctively. Hundreds of guests filled the room. Laughter echoed near the stage. Cameras flashed. Yet suddenly he felt as though someone had pulled back a curtain he never realized existed. Across the room, Charles was watching him carefully. Above them, hidden behind dark glass, Maya saw Richard lower the note and slowly turn toward his oldest friend. For the first time that evening, she could see doubt in his eyes. Richard folded the note and slipped it into his jacket pocket, but the words refused to leave his mind. Look closer at the people you trust most. It was not an accusation. It was not evidence. It was simply a suggestion. Yet somehow it carried more weight than a direct warning ever could. On stage, the auctioneer announced another winning bid. Applause swept across the ballroom. Crystal chandeliers glowed overhead. The evening continued exactly as planned, at least on the surface. Beneath that polished layer, Richard felt something changing. He began noticing details that had once blended into the background. Charles Bennett excusing himself from conversations more frequently. A brief exchange with a man Richard did not recognize. A phone screen turned away the moment someone approached. None of it proved anything. Still, doubt had a peculiar way of growing once invited inside. Across the ballroom, Maya remained in the operations room, studying the live feeds. New data continued arriving. Timelines, correspondence records, financial links stretching across multiple states. Every update strengthened the same conclusion. The challenge was no longer discovering the truth. The challenge was deciding when to reveal it. The man beside her adjusted his tie. "We can move now," he said quietly. Maya shook her head. "Not yet. The evidence is solid." "The evidence is solid," she agreed. "But timing matters." She looked through the tinted glass again. "If this unfolds the wrong way, the wrong person wins." Back below, Richard found himself drifting away from the center of the event. He moved toward a quieter section near a display of historical photographs from previous charity galas. For the first time in years, he wanted a moment without advisors, investors, or reporters. Just silence. Instead, he found another surprise. One photograph caught his attention. It had been taken 8 years earlier at a similar fundraiser. Richard recognized dozens of faces. Some retired, some gone, some still powerful. Then his eyes narrowed. Standing near the edge of the frame was a young woman carrying a serving tray. The image quality was not perfect, but the face looked familiar. Very familiar. Richard stepped closer. The woman in the photograph looked remarkably like Maya Brooks. 8 years ago. Long before tonight. Long before the mysterious badge. Long before he had ever noticed her. A strange realization settled over him. If it was Maya, then this operation had not begun 6 months ago. At least not from her perspective. Someone had been watching patterns for years. Someone had been patient. His phone vibrated. A new message appeared from an unknown number. There was no greeting.
No explanation.
Just a location inside the hotel and a time. 10 minutes. Richard stared at the screen. Every instinct told him to ignore it. Yet every question haunting him tonight pointed in the opposite direction. Above the ballroom, Maya watched as Richard read the message. Then she saw something she had been waiting for all evening. Instead of calling security, instead of asking Charles for advice, instead of dismissing the warning, Richard Whitmore slipped his phone into his pocket and quietly started walking toward the meeting point alone. The location in the message led Richard away from the music, away from the cameras, and away from the people who had spent years telling him exactly what he wanted to hear. The farther he walked through the hotel corridors, the quieter everything became. The distant sound of the gala faded behind thick walls and polished doors. He passed empty conference rooms, silent lounges, and framed artwork illuminated by soft golden lights. Every step gave him another chance to turn around. He took none of them. At the end of the hallway sat a private observation lounge overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed thousands of lights stretching across the city like a sea of stars. The room appeared empty at first. Then Richard noticed a single folder resting on a table beside the glass. No note, no instructions, just the folder. His pulse quickened. He approached cautiously and opened it. Inside were photographs, financial summaries, corporate records, communication logs. At first glance, they seemed unrelated. Then a pattern emerged. The The same names appeared repeatedly, the same shell companies, the same private meetings, and at the center of nearly every connection stood Charles Bennett. Richard stared at the documents. His first instinct was disbelief. There had to be an explanation. There had to be context he was missing. Charles had spent nearly 20 years helping him build Whitmore Capital. He had attended family celebrations. He had stood beside him during crises. Trust like that did not simply disappear because of a few pages in a folder. Yet the evidence continued. One page led to another. Dates matched. Transactions aligned. Private communications coincided with strategic decisions that had benefited everyone except Richard himself. The realization settled slowly, like a storm rolling across calm water. Some of the business setbacks he had blamed on competitors. Some of the lost opportunities he had accepted as bad luck. Some of the confidential negotiations that mysteriously unraveled. They all connected to the same source. A quiet sound behind him broke the silence. Richard turned. Maya Brooks stood near the doorway. She was no longer carrying a serving tray, no longer blending into the background. Yet somehow she looked exactly the same. Calm, steady, unimpressed by power. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The city lights reflected across the windows between them. Finally, Richard looked down at the folder. "How long?" he asked quietly. Maya understood the question immediately. "Long enough to know this was never about you." Richard frowned. "What does that mean?" Maya stepped closer to the table. "You were not the target." The words landed harder than he expected. All evening he had assumed the investigation revolved around him. His company, his reputation, his mistakes. Maya shook her head gently. "Someone wanted you distracted. Someone wanted you looking in the wrong direction." Richard looked back at the evidence, then at Maya, then back at the evidence again. Suddenly another memory surfaced. The spilled water, the public confrontation, his demand that she be fired. Maya had known what was happening long before he did. Yet she had never tried to humiliate him, never tried to embarrass him. Even now she spoke without anger, without revenge, without satisfaction, as if the truth itself mattered more than being proven right. And for the first time that night, Richard Whitmore began to understand who had actually saved him. Richard lowered himself into a chair beside the window and looked out across the city. For years he had believed success came from seeing farther than everyone else. Tonight proved how wrong that assumption could be. The skyline glittered beyond the glass, but all he could think about was how much had happened directly in front of him without being noticed. Maya remained standing near the table. She did not rush him. She did not pressure him toward any conclusion. She simply allowed the silence to do its work. Eventually Richard looked up. "Why stay undercover as a server?" Maya glanced toward the ballroom below. "Because people reveal themselves around people they do not notice." Richard absorbed the answer. It was simple, uncomfortable, true. He thought about every executive dinner, every charity event, every private gathering he had attended over the years. How many conversations had happened in front of staff members nobody acknowledged? How many assumptions had powerful people made because of a uniform? A faint smile touched Maya's face. Most people spend their lives trying to be seen. Invisible people hear everything. Richard looked down at the folder again. The evidence no longer felt abstract. Every page represented decisions made behind his back by someone he had trusted completely. Yet another question continued bothering him. "If you knew all this," he said quietly, "why not tell me immediately?" Maya's expression softened slightly. "Would you have listened?" The question landed harder than any accusation. Richard opened his mouth to answer. Nothing came out. He remembered the ballroom, the spilled water, his voice echoing across the crowd, his certainty, his arrogance. He had not asked a single question before passing judgment. Maya had given him opportunities to slow down. He ignored every one of them. The truth was obvious. No, he would not have listened. Not then. Maya could see the realization forming in his eyes. "People rarely accept information that threatens their assumptions," she said. Sometimes they have to discover it themselves. Down below, the gala continued moving toward its finale. Guests laughed. Donors celebrated successful bids. Reporters gathered near the stage. None of them knew the evening was approaching a turning point. A notification appeared on Maya's phone. She read it once and slipped the device back into her pocket. "It is time," she said. Richard stood. "Time for what?" Maya looked directly at him. "For the truth to stop hiding." Together they walked toward the ballroom entrance overlooking the main event floor. From above, Richard immediately spotted Charles Bennett near the stage speaking with several investors. He looked exactly the same as always. Confident, respected, trusted. Yet Richard now noticed details he had missed before. The calculated timing of conversations. The careful positioning. The way Charles seemed to know exactly where everyone important stood in the room. Maya handed Richard a single sheet from the folder. It contained a timeline connecting years of decisions to one carefully orchestrated strategy. Richard read the final entry and felt his breath catch. The gala itself had been part of the plan. Not the charity event. Not the fundraising. The business announcement scheduled for the end of the evening. An announcement that would have transferred extraordinary control into the hands of the one man Richard had trusted most. And unless something changed in the next few minutes, Charles Bennett was about to make it happen. The master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage and tapped the microphone. The ballroom gradually settled into silence. Conversations faded. Glasses lowered. Hundreds of guests turned their attention toward the front of the room, unaware that the evening they thought they understood was about to change completely. Charles Bennett stood near the stage with the relaxed confidence of a man expecting success. Investors gathered around him. Board members exchanged approving smiles. Everything appeared perfectly arranged, exactly as planned. Richard Whitmore remained on the upper level beside Maya. From a distance, he watched the scene unfold with entirely different eyes than he had an hour earlier. The documents in his hand felt heavier than paper. They carried years of hidden intentions, carefully disguised behind loyalty and friendship. Below them, Charles accepted a microphone and smiled warmly at the audience. The room responded immediately. He was respected, trusted, admired. "Before we conclude tonight's event," Charles began, "I would like to thank everyone who has supported our vision for the future." Applause followed. Cameras flashed. The words sounded generous, harmless. Yet Richard now recognized how carefully every sentence had been constructed. Maya stood quietly beside him. She did not interrupt. She did not tell him what to do. This decision belonged to him. Charles continued speaking about growth, innovation, and opportunity. Then he reached the moment Maya had warned him about. A large screen illuminated behind the stage. A presentation appeared. Charts, forecasts, strategic partnerships. To most guests, it looked like another ambitious corporate announcement. Richard knew better. Buried inside the proposal were provisions that would quietly shift extraordinary influence away from him and into structures controlled by Charles. It was elegant, legal, nearly invisible, the kind of move only someone with years of trust could execute successfully. Richard felt a wave of disbelief, not because the evidence was weak, because it was strong. Every page connected, every detail aligned. The truth was no longer a theory. It was standing under a spotlight, smiling at the audience. Then something unexpected happened. Richard looked at Maya. "Why save me?" he asked. Maya took a moment before answering. Because this was never about destroying someone. Her gaze remained fixed on the ballroom below. It was about stopping the wrong person from winning. Richard stared at her. The simplicity of the answer left him speechless. She had every reason to resent him. He had humiliated her publicly, judged her without understanding her, treated her as though she were invisible. Yet she had still chosen to help. Down on the stage, Charles reached the final portion of his presentation. The room was ready to celebrate. The investors were ready to applaud. The announcement was seconds away from becoming official. Richard folded the documents carefully. Then he straightened his jacket and stepped toward the staircase leading back to the ballroom floor. Maya watched him go. Her expression remained calm, steady, certain. For the first time that night, Richard was not walking toward a business victory. He was walking toward the truth. And waiting at the bottom of the stairs was the man who never expected him to discover it. Richard reached the ballroom floor just as the audience began applauding. Charles Bennett stood beneath the spotlight, smiling as though the future already belonged to him. Investors nodded approvingly. Board members exchanged confident glances. Everything was moving exactly according to the plan Charles had spent years building. Then Richard Whitmore stepped forward. The applause gradually faded. Charles looked surprised but recovered quickly. "Richard," he said warmly, extending a hand. "Perfect timing." Richard did not take it. The room noticed immediately. A strange silence settled across the ballroom. Charles lowered his hand. "Is something wrong?" Richard looked around the room before answering. "For years, I believed trust was built through time." His voice remained calm, measured. "Tonight I learned that trust is built through truth." Confused expressions spread among the guests. Reporters raised their phones. Investors leaned forward. Charles attempted a laugh. "I am not sure what this is about." Richard held up the folder. "I think you know exactly what it is about." The smile disappeared from Charles's face. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just enough for those paying attention to notice. Richard continued. He did not attack. He did not accuse. He simply presented facts, dates, records, decisions, patterns, one by one. The same details Maya had shown him upstairs. The room listened carefully. Some guests looked stunned. Others looked disappointed. A few appeared relieved, as though questions they had carried for years were finally receiving answers. Charles tried to respond. He tried to explain. But the confidence that had carried him through the evening was gone. The facts spoke louder than either man could. Minutes later, the presentation was suspended. The business announcement was withdrawn. Conversations erupted throughout the ballroom. Yet Richard barely heard them. His attention drifted toward the back of the room. He was searching for someone. Maya Brooks stood near a service entrance. Quiet, unnoticed by most of the crowd. Exactly where she seemed most comfortable. Their eyes met across the ballroom. Richard started walking toward her. By the time he reached the doorway, she was gone.
No farewell. No celebration.
No request for recognition. Only a small folded receipt resting on a nearby table. Richard picked it up. On the back, written in neat handwriting, were 5 simple words. Respect costs less than regret. Richard read them twice. Then he smiled. Not the confident smile of a billionaire accustomed to winning. Something quieter. Something wiser. Outside, the lights of Manhattan stretched into the distance. Inside, the gala continued without its illusion. And for the first time in a very long time, Richard Whitmore understood that the most important person in the room had never been the one standing under the spotlight. She had been the one everyone overlooked until the truth made her impossible to ignore.